Have you ever traveled in another section of the country and turned on the local news and really listened to the news anchors talking? Now, once upon a time, you would have heard a very distinctive drawl in, say, Atlanta or Birmingham, but a different twang in Cincinnati or Fayetteville, and an altogether unique accent in Portland, Maine. When I lived in Boston in the early 1980s, the morning anchors at WBZ were two somewhat older gentlemen. One delivered the news, the other sports and weather. And there came a point when they were both retiring. And among the words of appreciation they received was a recognition that they were the last major market newscasters still speaking in their own regional dialect. Because both of them had grown up in northern New England, and they still sounded like it. Hey. National news and the desire of news persons to move to the big time, the major markets in New York and Los Angeles, have driven out the sounds of regional speech from news broadcasts. And if you're familiar with other areas of the country and the way they sound, I just think it's sort of sad. All of us tend to speak in languages. Professional jargon, family shorthand, the jokes of our friendship circles. For 37 years, this congregation has spoken a language of sorts, and an important one. It's the language of progressive theology, radical inclusiveness, social conscience. And I might suggest that for the past 11 years, you have spoken that language in a certain, shall we say, Pauline accent. And all that is good, very good. The language we speak here is one that our wider community needs desperately to hear. And I can bear witness that this church has grown and blossomed under the influence of that fate upstate New York inflection. But let me suggest that the rest of the world, or at least folks who haven't found their way here yet, might be said to speak in different languages than the one we are accustomed to. Back in March, Reverend Jerry Stinson taught a series of adult Sunday school classes, and between sessions, he and I would chat. And one of the things he recently discovered, which has been on my radar screen as well, is that a critical approach to Scripture characterized by the Jesus Seminar, for instance, may not be as big a deal to some generations as it is to others. And it's not that, say, younger adults are blind followers of authority and therefore locked into a pre-critical acceptance of what tradition says about Jesus. Rather, it's that many of them have already moved beyond that, maybe even leapfrogged over that critical step and landed on, what does it mean for me anyway? Which seems to me to be the ultimate point. I mean, I like a good academic discussion as much as the next person, knowledge for knowledge's sake and all that. But sooner or later, information is only as good as what it offers us in the way of meaning and direction. And this is one of the reasons we're going to explore an enhanced use of the arts for our common life during this time of Paul's sabbatical and our sabbatical too. Because the arts can enable us to speak a different language, to communicate indirectly and symbolically with metaphor, image, movement. You know that people have different learning styles. For instance, I'm much more visual and kinetic than I am auditory. Books on tape, podcasts, in one ear and out the other. They just don't stick. But give me a real book on real paper, and I can turn the page, and when I'm done, I will be able to remember which side of the page held that important quote that I want to find again. Visual, kinetic. In the same way, people approach faith and its object, the holy, ultimate meaning, than which nothing is greater. Approach that with different styles. You might even call them different intelligences, because intellectual reasoning is not the only valid type. In a postmodern culture, we also value emotional intelligence, sensory intelligence, mystical intelligence. Think of the way our recent Faith and Works speakers, Rachel Held Evans and Justin Lee, can be incredibly progressive on social issues without needing to discard everything about their former, more evangelical approach to faith. They've got an emotional connection to certain images or expressions, for instance, and that doesn't contradict their commitment to other values which we share. There are lots of folks like that. Everyday people like you and me, influential leaders like Brian McLaren or Jim Wallace at Sojourners, scholars with something to say like Jennifer McBride or Walter Brueggemann. I dare say there are people in our own community who ache with the same passion that you do for justice, but may frame their faith in different ways, which is why I included those verses from 1 Corinthians. These are people who might very well join us in our questing, but who also might express some of their feelings in ways that aren't often heard around here. And Paul, the apostle, not our absent pastor, Paul would suggest that those unfamiliar voices are just as valuable, just as spirit-enabled, and worth listening to. Such is the dilemma of radical inclusiveness. Now, nerd alert here. The Silmarillion is prehistory for J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I warned you. And in it is a tale of creation. According to Tolkien, the world was created not with a divinely spoken word, but by a divinely conducted chorus. And even when the main motif is threatened by a rebellious angel's discordant theme, the heavenly conductor managed to bring it into harmony with his own. And it is that final polyphonic song which gives form to Middle-earth. Okay, nerd alert over. Suffice it to say, I think the Pentecost story has a point for us. The community around us is waiting to hear something meaningful, something transformative, just, and truthful. But it wouldn't hurt us to learn a different language, to become translators of the truths we've found into terms that make initial sense to someone else. Which brings me back to our Summer of the Arts. It's an opportunity for us to discover a different language, but also for us to learn how to use that language in service to others. In classical philosophy, there are three essential elements: truth, the good, we might call that justice, and beauty. Now, we're really good at the language of truth and justice here. Can we become conversant in the language of beauty as well? At least some of us. Our summer's going to explore that and even offer us some potential tools. And that may not seem as productive in these days, which fairly demand action and advocacy. But the Pentecost story has something to say about that too. Why were the disciples in that upper room at this moment? Because 10 days earlier, Jesus had told them to return to Jerusalem and wait. According to authors Anthony Robertson and Robert Wall, it's a reminder for them that you're not completely in charge here. The triumph of justice and peace, they suggest, does not rest on our work alone, but, at least in Scripture, on sensing and cooperating with the free activity of God. And waiting is required to discern that. This is partly what sabbatical is about for Paul and for us. We're waiting and attempting to discern what God is doing or desiring to do in our midst. And what we particularly hope to discover is how God is doing beautiful, good, uplifting, hopeful things, sometimes through us, and sometimes with and through others. Because in the midst of the struggle, we need the occasional reminder of what we're striving for and why it matters. Have you seen that meme of the Churchill quote? If we get rid of arts and music and poetry and all those things, what are we fighting for? Hence the summer's focus on arts, on the beautiful, so that we might demonstrate creative hope even as we challenge injustice. May it be so. And now let us share again in that vision of loving, peaceable community, which sustains and encourages us. I invite the Reverends Frank Lyman and Ken Wyatt to come forward and lead us.